miigwech. So diversity and inclusion have become buzzwords used by CEOs and world leaders. What they actually mean, and knowing that diversity and inclusion are important, and knowing where to begin with developing D&I programs or strategy are two different things. Many workplaces know that D&I is both the right thing to do and the smart thing to do, but simply don't know where to start. And I would say that the Barrie Chamber is exactly in that position. And getting the lid off the can is probably the most important part of it. So over the course of this session, Michael Bach, author of the best-selling and award-winning Birds of All Feathers, Doing Diversity and Inclusion Right, will share his six-step process for starting your D&I journey and seeing it through successfully. So I'd like to introduce Michael Bach from the Canadian Centre of Diversity and Inclusion. Welcome, Michael. Michael is the founder and chair of the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion. He is nationally and internationally recognized as a thought leader and subject matter expert in the fields of inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, bringing a vast knowledge of leading practices in a live setting to his work. Much of the learning in today's presentation can be explored further in Michael's book, Birds of All Feathers, Doing Diversity and Inclusion Right. So with that, Michael, welcome, and we're happy to have you here. I'm looking up because I'm on another screen, exactly what I was trying to avoid doing, but I'm gonna give you the mic or the kiosk and let you go with your presentation, and we'll be back in half an hour to answer questions. So with that, Michael, take it away.
Thanks so much, Paul. And hello to everyone. Good afternoon. I'm going to share my screen here. Thank you so much to the Barrie Chamber for allowing me to come in and participate, albeit virtually, hopefully soon in person, for this really important session. As Paul mentioned, we're going to do questions at the end, so please feel free to share those in the Q&A as we go through the session, or save them up to the end, however you'd like. Happy to answer any of your questions related to anything I talk about, or just diversity and inclusion broadly. I also appreciate, Paul, that you did a land acknowledgement. I think we're living in a pretty auspicious time as it relates to reconciliation with our Indigenous cousins. Of course, we're all aware of the discovery of 215 bodies in an unmarked grave in Kamloops, British Columbia. And I think we as a society have gotten stuck with land acknowledgement. We feel like, okay, we do land acknowledgement and that's it. That's reconciliation. But it's not. That's part of reconciliation. And there are so many more steps. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, there are 94 for employers. And I think it's really important now more than ever that we better understand our role in reconciliation. And there's an app that we discovered. It's called Whose Land, and you can find it online at whose, WHOSE.land, or you can download it from both the Apple and Google stores. And what I love about this app is twofold. One, it uses storytelling to explain the importance of land acknowledgement, the importance of recognition of our Indigenous cousins having been on these lands long before settlers and colonists came to these shores. But it also uses the GPS in your phone, your tablet, or your computer to tell you a little bit more about those lands. What are the traditional territories? What are the nearest First Nations? There are 634 First Nations in Canada, in addition to the Inuit and Métis. And also, what are the treaties and agreements related to those lands? I think if everyone just downloaded the app and learned a little bit more about the lands which you call home, we would be a little closer to moving towards reconciliation. A little bit more about me. I have been working in the diversity and inclusion space for 15 years now. Sorry, my slides aren't changing. My personal pronouns are he, him, his. I originally used to work in diversity for KPMG here in Canada. I was the national leader for diversity at KPMG for 7 years. I was also the Deputy Chief Diversity Officer for KPMG globally for 2.5 years. And the most important thing on this slide, and feel free to take a screenshot or write it down, is that I have a postgraduate certificate from Cornell University in diversity management. And why that's so important to today's conversation is it was really expensive. So I'm trying to get some value out of that. Anyway, moving on. I wrote a book. called Birds of All Feathers, Doing Diversity and Inclusion Rights, won some awards, it's a bestseller. You can find it on my website. Why did I write a book? Why in 2021 am I writing a book? Well, to be honest, having worked in diversity and inclusion for over 15 years, I see there's being two types of books about diversity. One is written by academics, and they come up with some fantastic ideas that are not necessarily applicable in real world settings when you get them into a workplace that kind of fall apart. The other is written by consultants who want to sell you something. So they give you enough information to get you to call them. And I totally rejected both of those things when I wrote this book. I said, I'm going to write this book particularly for entrepreneurs and small to medium-sized businesses, because there seems to be a lot of mystery around diversity and inclusion, but I don't think it should be that mysterious. So I wrote a book and I gave away all the secrets. Today's presentation is based on one of the chapters in the book. It's called The Right Way to Do Diversity. And don't worry, you don't have to have read it in order to understand what's going on. If you have read it, congratulations. Thank you for your money. You're ahead of the game, but I hope that I will give you some more context on each of the steps as part of that. There's a lot of ways that you can do diversity and inclusion wrong, but that's more about specific actions versus the sort of process of doing this. Truthfully, I don't get asked this question enough. What is the right way to do diversity? Most employers start at the middle and jump to tactics. They'll call me and they'll say, oh, we need unconscious bias training. Great. Why? I always ask why. And usually it's, oh, we heard about it, or we saw a webinar, or, but they don't really understand why they need it. They don't take the time to plan. And as the saying goes, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. If D&I is such a priority for the organization, why isn't there a plan? So after 15 years, nearly two decades, I'm trying not to think about that, of working in the space, I've come up with a 6-step process that I believe is leading practice in D&I. And I say leading practice instead of best practice because I think saying best is a bit arrogant and it suggests that there's nothing better. But this process that I'm going to outline for you seems to work consistently no matter what organization you're in, large or small, public or private, local, national, international. Because all businesses function the same. Money in, money out. It's a pretty standard process. And I really believe firmly that the process I've outlined, you can't skip a step. You can't jump to the end. So no matter where you are on your journey as you're watching this, there is something that I believe you'll learn in this presentation. I'm going to go through each step in detail. And then, like I said, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. So the first step, the business case. This gets skipped the most because people think we're past it, but we're not. If we were past the business case, then we wouldn't need to focus on diversity and inclusion at all because we would have equity in society. We would have justice in society. But when you consider that 1% of the companies on the Toronto Stock Exchange that are traded on the stock exchange, only 1% are held by women. 1%. Women still make 76 cents on the dollar for equitable jobs to men. I could go on and on with statistics that tell you that we are not living in a moment where we're past the business case. People still need the business case. One thing that the business case doesn't talk about is the moral imperative, the right thing to do. And I don't tend to use that language. Not that I don't believe it's the right thing to do. I absolutely believe it's the right thing to do. I've committed my life to this. But the problem in saying it's the right thing to do is it assumes that everyone you're saying it to believes it's the right thing to do and agrees it's the right thing to do. And when times get tough and there is, say, oh, I don't know, a global pandemic, then if you're only doing it because it's the right thing to do, it may fall off the table because you're focused on other things like making sure your business stays alive. The business case answers the why question. Why does it matter? Why is your organization focused on diversity and inclusion? Why are you spending money on it? Why are you committing people to it? Why is this an imperative for the success of your organization? You have to have a concrete answer to these questions. And think of it like your elevator speech, like an elevator pitch. You need to put something together that is going to convince someone of your argument. So what does a business case look like? Well, we have a guide on our website called Locking in Your Leadership, a toolkit for developing the ironclad business case for diversity and inclusion. It's available free. You can check it out at ccdi.ca. And while we created that, it was one of the first things we created when I started CCDI 8 years ago. It still stands the test of the time because it's a framework. It doesn't tell you what should be in your business case. It just tells you how to go about getting that information. And when you think about your business case, there are five potential key components or stakeholder groups that you need to think about, and think of them like legs of a chair. So first is your people. Who do you hire? Who do you retain? Who do you promote? Then there's your customer. Who do you do business with? And everyone has a customer in some way, shape, or form. Even if you're business to business, you have a customer. Hospitals have a customer, it's patients. Cities have a customer, it's citizens. So who is your customer, and do you understand their needs? Third is your brand. And I'm not talking just about your logo. I'm talking about how you're known in the market, which of course connects back to your people and your customer. Then we get suppliers and compliance. Now, I don't tend to talk a lot about these two things, largely because one, compliance is not optional. If you are subject to the Employment Equity Act, you don't have a choice. Here in Ontario, we have the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. That is not optional. You have to be in compliance. So I tend to avoid speaking about compliance. The other component, supplier diversity, is a very advanced conversation. And truthfully, very few organizations are actually talking about supplier diversity in any real concrete way. So we're going to take those two out, and that leaves us with a three-legged stool. I always want to say chair, but then that chair falls over. So it's a three-legged stool for things for you to consider. As you're writing your business case, think about your people. Think about why that matters. Are you having trouble finding people? Are you having trouble finding the right people? It's all about who you hire, who you retain, who you promote, who you fire. Then there's your customer. Do you want more customers? Are you managing to meet the needs of your existing customers? Who are your customers? And who could your customers be? And third is your brand. And again, that's about how you're perceived in the market. Are you known as an inclusive employer? Are you known as an inclusive supplier? If you're not, that's something you need to consider as part of your business case. A few other things to consider with your business case: keep it short and simple. People have the attention span of goldfish. So make sure you keep it under 2 pages. If it's more than 2 pages, you've lost me. And so keep it very short and very simple. Make sure it's organization specific. It needs to speak the language of your organization. I can give you TD's business case, but if you're not a big bank it's not going to resonate. So you need to make sure it speaks your organization's language. Lastly, make sure it has data, research, and facts. Language like it's the right thing to do, it's that slippery slope of the moral imperative. Why does it matter? Look at the demographics in your community. Look at any sort of data point. Look at the research around the benefits of diversity and inclusion from a financial perspective. Whatever message is going to resonate with your audience, use that data, research, and fact. The second step is the assessment. After you have the business case, you do the assessment. What is the problem you're trying to solve for? And this is, again, is the question that I ask whenever I get a call from somebody saying we need unconscious bias training. You need to conduct some form of assessment to understand if and what the issue is. And there are lots of different versions of assessments, but I'm going to give you some examples of what an assessment could include. First of all, leadership assessment. So understanding the leadership of your organization. How do they feel about diversity and inclusion? What are their perspectives? Second is demographics. Who are your people? And I could go on for hours about demographics and the importance of understanding who your people are. But it's important to make sure you understand who your current people are so you understand who your people could be. Inclusion surveys. This is about understanding how your people feel about working in the organization. Do they feel valued? Do they feel connected to who you are as an organization? You can conduct a maturity analysis, which compares where you are to leading practices around diversity and inclusion. There's something called the Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Benchmarks, or GDEIB. If you Google it, it's a free report, and it is 20 years of best practices in diversity and inclusion, all vetted by people like me. It's an excellent resource, but it'll help you to understand, are you leading or are you lagging? Last but not least is a competitor analysis. And it depends if you're really motivated by what your competitors do. I know that when I was at KPMG, it was a big motivator. Like the questions was, well, what's Deloitte doing? And what's Ernst & Young doing? And what, yeah, okay, I get it. It was a big motivator. So if it's something that resonates with you, great. Take a look at what your competitors are doing. Sometimes that's easier said than done, but just get a sense if you are at the front of the pack or the back or the middle. Assessments can be really big and complicated, or they can be really small and simple. It's up to you. It's up to how big your organization is, how much time and money you want to spend on this. You have data. Every employer is required, in the province of Ontario, is required to collect the binary sex and age of every employee in the company as soon as they start. So you have some data that you can work with already. You don't have to run out and do a big demographic survey. You've got some of the building blocks. And it's totally fine to use your existing data to conduct an assessment. While you could hire a very reasonably priced and attractive consultant, you don't have to. And it's really hard for small to medium-sized enterprises to justify those dollars. So you can do this yourself. What matters is that you ask the questions so that you better understand what the issues are. If you think you know, think again. Ask people how they're feeling, and you will get some information that will help drive your work in diversity and inclusion. Step 3 is to develop a strategy. So once you have the assessment, you develop a strategy to address the problems that you have found in the assessment. This is about the how. What are you going to do? What initiatives are you going to introduce? What programs? How are you going to solve the problem? This is where you get very tactical. And There are a number of things around a strategy that I could talk to you about. First and foremost, again, it needs to speak the language of your organization. It needs to resonate with who you are as an organization. Because again, I can give you TD's strategy, but that will not help you because they have 80,000 employees around the world. They're massive organizations. They've got big teams of people working on DEI. That's not going to work for you. So it's important that your strategy speaks the language of your organization. Another key consideration is to make sure that it's SMART. And I mean the acronym: specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, and timely. Specific, what are you going to do? You can't say things like, oh, we're going to make our organization the best place to work. That's not specific. That's very vague and very difficult to measure, which leads to number 2, measurable. Everything must have a measurement attached to it. I'm going to talk about that in a second. Attainable. How attainable is this goal? You need to make sure that it is an attainable goal and in turn realistic. So if you think you're going to have, 50% women in management positions in your organization in 5 years, and you're currently at 1%, that is not a realistic goal. And last but not least, you need to make it time bound. How long is it going to take from start to finish to actually get it done? It's really important that you apply this lens to anything you're considering. The other thing I would say is don't boil the ocean. So what happens a lot of times is that employers they'll take on 20 things and they will fail at all of them. So you're better to say, you know what, we're going to do 3 short-term initiatives, meaning they can be done in less than 12 months. We're going to take on 2 medium, meaning they can be done in 1 to 2 years. And we're going to take on 1 big initiative that'll be done in 3 to 5 years. So that way, you've got some short-term stuff that is very visible that people will see. They will see the change while you're working on the medium and long term, which may not be as visible and will take a longer period to produce results. So it is very important that you balance those out. That's a total of 6 initiatives, and that's plenty. Unless you have full-time resources, you've got a big budget, it is totally reasonable and I would say advisable to take on fewer things, deliver them successfully, and make sure you're doing the right thing. Step 4, not terribly complicated. Execute. This is the hard part. You actually have to do the work. And I will tell you that there is a secret ingredient when it comes to execution, and that is change management. We use a number of different models, there are a number of different models from a change management perspective. This is called the ADKAR model. And like I said, there's lots of different models you can use from a change management perspective. Consider that what we're doing is all about change. It's about taking your organization and moving it from one state to another. And everyone hates change, right? It's not entirely true. Our brains hate change. And this has to do with our ancestral brain and bias and stereotypes and the way our brains work. But we, generally speaking, get used to the way things are done. And it's really hard for our brains to adjust because it means we're using up more resources, more energy. So applying a change management lens will help you to execute on your whatever initiative you're undertaking to make sure it's being successful. And part of building a change management model is understanding where your people are coming from. And this is a model that I was introduced to at KPMG. It's actually from a course called Leading with Passion and Change from Johnson Smith International in 2002. And sadly, Johnson Smith is no longer in existence. They were bought, and then that company was bought. And so I suspect this course is long gone. But this model really resonated with me because it really just helps you to understand where people are from a change perspective. So I'll go through each one of them. You start with your fighters on the left-hand side. These are people who are actively fighting against the change. They are people who they do not believe in what you're doing. They have not bought in. They are actively fighting against what you're doing. Next is your foes, similar to fighters, but they're not active. They disagree with what you're trying to do, but they're not actually doing anything to fight against it. Then we get to our fence sitters. And this is where the majority of people sit, is in the fence sitting. They aren't fighting it. They don't disagree. They don't necessarily agree. Essentially, they don't necessarily see what's in it for them. So they haven't necessarily bought in. Then you've got your friends. These are people that believe in the change, but they're not actually helping you. They're not going out of their way to affect the change and make the change happen. Then we come to our family. And these are people who have completely bought into what you're trying to do, and they are actively working with you towards the change. So building out each of these profiles as part of your execution plan is really important because it helps you to understand where a person may be coming from. And in fact, I've seen it done where, like they give each profile a name and a picture, and they really try to get their heads around who that person is. So are they a fence sitter, meaning that they're neutral to the entire thing because they don't think it impacts them? They're the easiest to sway. If you're focusing on one particular group, focus on your fence sitters. They're the easiest to move from fence sitter to friends. The further along from the left, the easier it is to actually move them along. Are they a fighter in that they are fighting the change? How are you going to get them on your side? How are you going to move them from fighter to foe? You're not going to get them all the way to family overnight. So get them from fighter to foe so they stop pushing against what you're trying to do. The fighters, I will tell you, are the hardest to push over the edge because they're very entrenched in their beliefs. But consider each grouping, each profile, and figure out how and what it will take to move people along with the ultimate goal of getting them to family. That's our whole ultimate goal. We want people to be part of the change. Like I mentioned at the top, we all have a role to play in reconciliation, and we all have a role to play in inclusion. It's not one person's job. It's everyone's job. So what is everyone's role? And to do that, you need to move them all ultimately to family. Step 5 is measurement. And I mentioned I was going to talk about it. It's really, really important. How are you going to know if you're successful? And I use the analogy of a chocolate bar, mainly because I have a bit of a sugar addiction. Imagine if Mars decided that they were going to introduce a blueberry Mars bar, which, if anyone works for Mars, I think is a genius idea. So before they even develop the product, they do a whole bunch of research, a whole bunch of market research, product testing, packaging and design. And then they put the product on the market and they measure it within an inch of their life to understand if it's a successful product. There's measurement at every step of the engagement so that they know if they have a winner on their hands. That's the same case for diversity and inclusion. Every initiative you put in your strategy needs to have some form of measurement attached to it. And your broader diversity and inclusion strategy overall needs to have those measurements so you know when you've been successful. Ask yourself, what data do you already have? Like I said, you've already got sex and age. Don't ask for data from your people or create reports that won't get used. It's so important. Measurement is so important that I have an entire chapter in my book dedicated to it. There's a variety of things that you can measure. And I'm going to break them down into 3 buckets. First is measuring diversity, meaning measuring demographics. Overall, who are your people? And then comparing that to your available talent. Who are your people and what are the demographics of Barrie, if all of your people come from Barrie or the surrounding areas, to make sure that you are reflective of the available talent. But then you can dig a bit deeper. You can look at the demographics of applicants in the talent attraction process. Who's applying to jobs for your organization? And are you missing out potentially on any one group? You look at demographics and performance rating. Is there a difference between the way one group is rated from a performance perspective versus another? Look at demographics and promotions. Are people being promoted at the same rate regardless of their demographics? And then demographics and pay. This is what we call a pay equity audit, to make sure that people are being paid the same for the same job. Data doesn't lie. Data is just numbers. You may not like the numbers. I do not like the number that the scale tells me I weigh, but I think it's lying because I'm wearing baggy clothing. They're just numbers. It's not good or bad. They just are. Either there is a gap or there isn't. If there is a gap, you can and should do something about it. Then we get to measuring inclusion. And for some people, they think this is a bit harder. It's not as hard as you think it is. There's a few ways you can measure the inclusiveness of your organization. So conducting an inclusion survey or an engagement survey, they are not the same thing. Engagement surveys tell you how people feel about their work, how committed to their work they are. Inclusion surveys tell you how people feel about working for your organization. Do they feel included? Excuse me. The important thing about both inclusion and engagement surveys is that you look at the data through the demographic lens. So you cross-segment the data. So as an example, let's say I asked the question, I feel valued at work, and I got an 80% score. So 80% of participants said agree or strongly agree. That's great, right? You think, oh, wow, that's from a survey perspective, that's a good number. But if you then split it by binary sex of female and male, and you found that, and assuming that you're 50-50, just for my example, and you found that your males were at 95% and your females were at 65%, that's a big problem. That means that there's a 30% split between groups in terms of how they are experiencing the organization. So it's important with an inclusion survey to make sure you're segmenting the data. Then you can do focus groups where you take a group of women, a group of people of color, a group of indigenous, whatever, and have conversations about their lived experience in the organization. Also, one-on-one interviews. Depending on how large the organization is, focus groups may not be realistic, so you can switch those up to one-on-one interviews. I will say that with some of this, it's better to do it with an outside vendor so that they can provide some level of anonymity and as bias-free as possible. So what are some other things that you can measure? Well, you can measure your initiatives. Like I said, each activity must have a measurement for it. How do you know if you've been successful? Let's say you decide to roll out e-learning to everybody in the organization. Your success measure can simply be the number of people who complete the e-learning. That's a perfectly good success measure. But make sure you have some form of measurement attached to each initiative. Again, a maturity assessment, understanding how mature you are as an organization around diversity and inclusion. Does your organization have a diversity council, and is it chaired by the most senior person in the organization? We know that that is a leading indicator related to D&I in an organization. So we already know what the leading indicators are. How do you compare against them? Industry benchmarking, again, coming back to your competitors to understand where your industry is. There are some industries that are very far advanced on this conversation, others that are not so. So it might be helpful for you to better understand where you fall in the pack, which then may drive your behavior to either catch up or not. Last but not least is the return on investment. And some people really shy away from this, and I think that's a mistake. I think you should understand what's the financial impact. if you're investing time and money, you should understand what the impact is on your organization. How are you getting money back? So as an example, let's say that your voluntary turnover rate is 20%. So 20% a year, people leave the organization. And let's say that the cost of a voluntary turnover, the cost to replace a person who leaves voluntarily is $50,000, okay? And let's say you spend $150 per person in the organization on diversity and inclusion, and you see a 1% decrease in your voluntary turnover. Well, that 1% decrease in voluntary turnover may be costing you easily tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars every year. That small investment in diversity and inclusion is resulting in the reduction the reduction of voluntary turnover, which equates to savings. So it's a complicated process to measure the return on investment, but you should be looking at the benefits you receive as a consequence, because that will get you to spend more money and put in more effort. Step 6 is the least complicated. Rinse and repeat. It's really important to understand that this is not a linear process, that the change is constant. We describe this as a journey without a destination. You're on the road, but there's no place you're actually trying to get to, because it is constantly changing. Consider that a few years ago, we were not talking about the need for gender inclusive restrooms. That wasn't on anyone's radar. And then the law changed. And now we're talking a lot about gender inclusive restrooms. A year ago, May 25th, we were not talking about racism in this country. I couldn't get anybody to talk about racism in this country. And I tried, believe me. And then George Floyd was murdered in front of our eyes. And now we're talking about anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism and anti-Asian racism. And I'm thrilled, because we're finally having a conversation about racism. But that wasn't happening a year ago. This is a constantly evolving, constantly changing topic. It isn't a program. It isn't something you're going to do and then, okay, we're done, we're diverse and inclusive, because something else will come up and you'll need to adapt to that. When you look at those 5 steps, you're constantly revisiting them. Is your business case still relevant? I used to reread my business case that I wrote at KPMG. I reread it every single year just to make sure that I was still in the right place, that it still made sense, that it was still relevant. You need to revisit your assessment. And before anybody asks, I say between 24 and 36 months. Consultants will tell you you need to do this every 12 months. I wholeheartedly disagree, because you cannot affect enough change in 12 months to see better results from your assessment. And assessments can end up being a big piece of work. So I say between 24 and 36 months, because you need to understand if you've had an impact, if the work you're doing with your strategy is actually producing the intended results. You need to revisit your strategy. If you've got new problems, you need new solutions. If from an execution place, you're constantly revisiting. And like I said, because this is constantly changing, you need to be very nimble. You need to be able to adapt very quickly, so that if something comes up, like 215 bodies being discovered in an unmarked grave, and you need to pivot, you need to do it quickly. So there's a lot about nimbleness in this. And measurement, measure. You need to continually measure so that you know when you've been successful. The way the human brain functions is we thrive off of those moments of change. We thrive off seeing the results. So it's really important that you measure and continually revisit each of the steps in the process over and over, so that you know when you've been successful. And with that, I'm pretty close to time. and I would love to take some of your questions. So I'm going to stop sharing so you can see my pretty face.
That was great. I mean, a lot of the acronyms you use there are very common, common language, which I think, again, makes it easier for people to kind of embrace it because it's not something that's completely a completely new concept. We've got a few questions in here, but I was kind of, as you were going through it, I'm trying to think where we are within our organization. And the chamber is a different animal because we internally we have an organization, and then we support businesses. So the part of the purpose of doing this is to be able to provide resources. So, I think you got to start at home and then, and live it, breathe it kind of thing. And that's what we're sort of trying to do. So I'm trying to think in this process, where do we stand and what's our position within the whole framework? And it kept sort of coming up. Well, if we're already kind of fairly aware of that because we've been working on it, is it okay to start in the middle? And I think, what sort of came to mind, and especially when you got to the back, rinse and repeat, it becomes even more important at that point that you're always starting somewhere, whether you're 4 or 5 or whatever. I mean, it's a constant rollover. And anytime there's a change in your organization, you have to reevaluate that. So we bring summer students in. When the summer student comes in, it changes the makeup of our business and the way that we operate. And that may be because of a gender issue, and maybe not issue, maybe because of gender, maybe because of experience level. It's going to change how you're made up. And it may even change the language to a certain extent. So I think that is probably one of the more important parts, is that this will fall off the side of your table immediately if you're not paying attention to it constantly.
Totally. I describe it like driving a car up a hill without brakes.
Right.
If you take your foot off the gas, you are going backwards, my friend. There is no way to avoid that.
And I think
yeah, please go.
Well, I was going to say, I think that's why businesses either don't engage and start with this because they maybe realize that, it's not something I can maintain. But at any rate, it's interesting. So sorry, I cut you off there and I shouldn't have done that. I apologize.
No, it's okay, Paul. I mean, I was just going to say, from the chamber's perspective, there very much is an internal look, right? Who are you as an employer? But then you also have this added layer of supporting your members. Yeah. Who are the members of the chamber? And are you missing out on businesses, maybe from immigrant communities or women-owned business? Who are the business owners in the Barrie area that are not necessarily seeing themselves in the chamber? I don't know the answer to that, but it's the question you ask. And the other thing I was going to say is even the Barrie Chamber needs to have a business case. You need to understand what that is. And I could write it in probably half an hour just to say, it's about being a great employer and supporting your community. It doesn't need to be complicated. I think we tend to overcomplicate this stuff. Yeah. And it's we can simplify it and get a lot of things done.
Yeah, I would agree. In our case, and I've said this even to our own team as we started to kind of move in this direction, is that we have a stigma attached to the chamber in terms of being a fairly conservative organization. We're trying to be as centralist as we can, but you're always going to get painted on that on one side or the other, and especially as the political cycle happens, right? Where we're highlighting conservatives or we're highlighting whatever, and you get sort of painted into a corner at times. And that's kind of not where I want the chamber to go. I think we're a leader within the business community. We need to lead with our practices, but also lead with, from a thought leadership standpoint. And that's why we're trying to get involved with it. And it's funny, what was thought to be, in my mind, a relatively simple thing is a lot more complicated. So although you need to keep it simple, it is a lot more complicated in making sure that everyone understands your position and why you're doing things, what your motivations are. And that kind of leads to me, to a couple of questions in here. How do we as a business, and I'll open this up, get on board with these types of socialists without seeming like we're jumping on the bandwagon? And I don't know. I mean, to me, if there's this isn't like the Leafs, right? I mean, this is, I think, a bandwagon you want to jump on and forget about your motives at the beginning. If you get far enough into it, I think that changes. And as long as you're on the wagon and allow it to evolve, then you're on the right track.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I do think there is a point there, and we saw a lot of this last May when George Floyd was killed, and there was a lot of performative actions, people posting messages on social media. And there were a lot of communities of color and Black Lives Matter who called these employers out to say, you have no Black executives, you have no, there's nothing being done. This is just to make you feel better about yourself, yet you've done nothing. So I get that. I think the way I would suggest is to make sure you've got a business case, know what you're doing, avoid getting caught up in the sort of flurry of activity of, oh, we've got to post this message and we've got to post that message. It's a risk. Doing that is a risk. Social media is just toxic soup. It is. I don't know that it's helping anybody, although follow me online. And I think we need to avoid that sort of performative action. Focus on your organization first. Make sure you get your ducks in a row, and then you can start speaking out. When you have something to be proud of, you can start speaking out about it. Yeah. And I would say, Paul, this is not political. And I really try to avoid taking this into a political sphere. This isn't about conservative or liberal or NDP. Yeah. This is about what's good for us as a society, regardless of your political leanings. Yeah. I think political parties need to pay more attention to this, because the color of my skin does not dictate my political leanings. And you can have women who are conservative. You can have people of color who are conservative. You can have LGBTQ2 plus people who are conservative. Yeah. It is not indicative, but the parties need to make sure that they are open to everyone, and that includes their policies. So I try to avoid that political leaning with all of that, because I do think that that's a bit of a red herring.
Yeah, without a doubt. And again, I'm more highlighting it because it's one of those reasons that always gets brought up as why not to do this. Sure. And to be honest with you, I don't necessarily subscribe to that. I think we should be doing it because and not to say that it's the right thing to do is why you do things. To Shelley Skinner's point here, we need to move beyond the right thing to do. But you do have to have a starting point. And to us, I don't know, I made a comment to somebody the other day about boiling the frog. We're going to get involved in this, and we're going to slowly get more and more involved in it. And then it's just become what we do on a regular basis. And I think that's where you start to have some success. Mm-hmm. But again, I think doing it with facts, because that, we are in a business community, is a right way of doing it, because maybe that's the way that somebody can get their head around it. And if it doesn't matter how you get them there, as long as you do in some way, shape, or form, right? So, So another question in here: should I hire the most qualified candidate or the candidate that will make my workplace more diverse?
It's a great question. And I have a very simple answer: hire the best candidate. Right. Always hire the best candidate. Yeah. It is, no one is asking for special circumstances. No one is suggesting that you should lower your standards in order to hire a person who doesn't look like me. I mean, I realize that some of the people on the webinar are probably thinking, this guy's white, right? Totally, very white, like basically translucent. I'm still gay and I live with a disability, but I am a white man. You still hire the best person for the job. You just have to be thinking about a number of things as part of that process. Is there bias in your hiring process? Yeah. Because the way our brains work is that we are drawn to people who look like us, who have similar lived experiences. So we do things in interviews like we ask about the Leafs. Hey, did you see the game? Well, right away, you've created a bias, because if that person is not into hockey, or God forbid, not into the Leafs, I can't even imagine who's not into such a winning team, that you're biased against them. So you can look at your talent attraction process, your interviewing process, and say, okay, so as an example, if I get a resume and it's got a name like Shaniqua Jones, who is a very dear friend of mine, or Cinnamon Stacy, who has the best name I've ever heard, versus I get a name, I get the same resume and it says Shirley Jones on it. Statistically speaking, they've done studies that Shirley Jones will get 20 times more callbacks than Shaniqua Jones.
Yeah.
So you have to know that that's the case. So look at the skills and experience. What are the qualifications that you're looking for? So I could go on and on about talent attraction. My point is that you absolutely hire the best.
Right.
Just as long as you make sure it's an equitable process. And when you get down to the end and you've got two people in front of you and you've got a white guy and you've got a woman, a person of color, or a queer person, an indigenous person, whatever, and they are, for all intents and purposes, the same. That's when diversity can be brought into the consideration. Mm-hmm. If you've said it's a priority, that's when you bring it in, but only at the very, very end.
Yeah, I think another question to ask is if you're never getting applications from people of color or from a diverse background or that intersectionality or whatever it is, that's a bigger question. Yep. Is my organization projecting that we are not involved or interested in bringing that type of person into our mix? I think that's an important way to start, and then you go from there, because then you're going to attract the right, and have those opportunities to hire people that have the right skill sets that may have a diverse background. And
exactly,
that's a good answer.
And that comes back to the brand piece of the conversation: is, are you known as an inclusive employer? Right. Are you reaching out to different communities? The other thing we do here, which is a terrible habit, is we post everything on Indeed and hope for the best. So it makes the assumption that if I'm a newcomer from Somalia and I've landed in Barrie, I'm looking at Indeed. I know what Indeed is. So are you reaching out to immigrant serving agencies? Mm-hmm. Are you reaching out to different community organizations and advertising your jobs? Keeping in mind that, and this is the struggle that small businesses face, is you're competing against massive employers. You're competing against the city. You're competing against the province, your feds. You're competing against big business. You don't necessarily have the advantage of having that big name brand. And so you do have to do some outreach into different communities to make sure that they know that you want to hire them.
Absolutely. We got a bunch of questions here. We got 7 minutes left, so I'm going to try to bang through them as quickly as I can. But I think it's also important to kind of recognize as well that we're going into a time frame where, much like when you're trying to sell your house now, it's a seller's market. Well, we're kind of going into an employer's market, and they're going to make decisions on where they want to go based on the company that they're applying to. And if you don't have your ducks in a row, you'll miss out on the best talent because they're going to go where they're going to feel included.
Absolutely.
Right. So from a business case standpoint, I think you want to be the employer of choice. And that's one way that you can get yourself there. From the chat, sorry, we had a question about what's the best way to find government statistics that relate to DEI?
We have dreadful data here. StatsCan is the keeper of the data. Of course, they only do the census every 5 years. The questions are not sort of the most progressive, but it is still StatsCan. Fortunately, they just are in the process of finalizing the census, the 2021 census. So we should have new data in about 8 to 12 months time. And it's not a perfect process. I wish it were. Currently we're relying on the 2016 data, which is woefully out of date.
Yeah. I was talking to somebody about it the other day, and about the question of first language would be, a better indicator, in terms of diversity than, what they've done in the past. But I think this one had a bit more of a long form component to it. So we should get better data, because I think most organizations are relying off 2016. And it's way outdated. I mean, even in terms of our makeup, and I think it was out of whack even when they did it. I think it was even saying in Simcoe County we had like a decrease in immigrant population, which was absolutely not the case. So
and that was the year that they only did the short form census. So
didn't ask that question, right? So there was no way of figuring it out.
Yeah.
Okay. So like I said, I'm trying to get through as many of these as I can. there was another comment in the chat with regards to turnover being the key. So start from the beginning. Exit interviews and surveys are key.
Absolutely.
And that's a great point. That's a great point. I worked for McDonald's for many years, and we always did exit interviews. We weren't always doing it from a diversity and inclusion standpoint, but we wanted to do what we were doing right, what we were doing wrong, and it was a great indicator of, maybe there was something wrong in your orientation process or a 30, 60, 90 check-in, standpoint.
Yeah, and when you're doing an exit interview, you're not necessarily asking questions about diversity. What you're doing is asking the same questions, but then, oh, is this coming from a woman? Is it from a person of color? Is it a person with a disability? So that you can then start to compare and say, oh, look, women are really not, women are leaving at a higher rate, and this is the reason. So you start to get some really great data that you can use to improve things in your organization.
Yeah. Sorry, I just want to go through and see if there's something in here we haven't. Okay, so I'm a small company, not in a position to hire in the near future. What steps can I take towards diversity and inclusion right now outside of staffing? I think you covered some of that in your talk, so maybe worthwhile kind of just to reiterate that.
Yeah,
the point of your internal practices and things that you can do on pay equity and those kinds of things, right?
Exactly. Focus on the inclusion of diversity and inclusion. Focus on making sure that you have have awareness around bias in the hiring process, that you are putting in systems that are inclusive, that you have an accessible workplace. Do the work now so that when you do start to hire, you can start to hire people from different communities.
Right, for sure. So here's a question from another aspect, and I think this is what happens quite often, is that what's the best way, and there's another question at the bottom about getting your executives to buy in when they're resistant. So I think these are two fairly similar. What's the best way to tell your manager that you don't feel your workplace is inclusive in a way that will open up the conversation instead of them feeling attacked?
Yeah.
And I think that ties into getting your executives on board. Like if they don't have a progressive thinking management team or leadership group, how do you get this, without quitting and creating that obvious, I'm not happy here kind of answer. How do you get them to come on board?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it can be a really hard thing to bring up depending on your relationship with your manager. If you have a good relationship, then sitting down with them and saying, this is my experience and this is how I'm feeling. If you don't, and you don't feel comfortable doing that, and this comes to the leadership, is I would go away and really write a business case that articulates why it's important and speaks the language of the leadership. So as an example, when I wrote the business case at KPMG, it was focused on money. I worked for accountants. They were very motivated by money and data. So coming up with the business case that is really going to resonate with your leadership and is one of those sort of, you can't get away from the proof in the pudding, right? Like it's just so obvious. As an example, there's a report from Catalyst that says that if you have 3 or more women on your boards, or organizations with 3 or more women on your boards, outperform their competitors 46% return on equity. Why do you not have 3 women on your boards? Run and find them quickly. And there's lots of women who would be great candidates for your boards. So making sure that you've got some really solid data. If your manager isn't receptive to the conversation and you don't feel like you have another mechanism, whether that's HR, whether that's going to your manager's manager, whatever is the case, unfortunately, you may have to vote with your feet. Mm-hmm. And the reality is, as to your point, Paul, we are very much coming into a period of it's an employee's world. Mm-hmm. And the employers that are not focused on this are going to wake up to a brutal message in the not too distant future, because they are not going to have access to employees. They're not going to have access to talent. Yeah. So it's the ones that are not paying attention to this are not going to be around for very long. Yeah,
for sure. And again, I mean, in a lot of cases, your market is going to be, from our immigrant population. It may not be visually different. I mean, until they speak or whatever, but I mean, the amount of talent that they are bringing with them in higher education And again, if you don't think that they're paying attention to your practices, you're out of your mind. I mean, that's definitely something they're looking at. So, you know, for any businesses in Barrie, even looking at Barrie, you know, there are micro economies all the way through our city. And you can see that in Facebook groups. You can see that in the increase in more diverse foods and culture from that perspective. And it's slowly, you know, something becoming more a part of our everyday life, but we're still not anywhere near where we need to be with it. And again, with our city growing at the rate that it is, you know, and the plans for additional manufacturing, additional, you know, employment to keep people living here as well as working here, you know, you should make sure that you have this as a part of your process moving forward. There's 3 more questions in here, but we're at time and a little over, so I think I'll cut it off. And Michael did agree. Any questions that weren't answered, he would be happy to supply answers for those. So you have his contact information, and Julie will be happy to send that stuff out as well to attendees, so that if you didn't get a question answered, we can get back to you. But Michael, I appreciate you coming today, and it was a great conversation and really important practical things. I think that's a lot of the times, you know, we hear from people, how do we get this started? So a really good step for that, for sure. So you have a new book coming out in March this year?
I do, yes.
You want to tell
Alphabets. Yeah, it's called Alphabet Soup, the quintessential guide to LGBTQ2+ inclusion. And it's designed for employers and churches and hospitals and schools to help create more inclusive spaces for LGBTQ2+ people. So it comes out March 29th of 2022, which seems like a lifetime from now. But
so when it comes out, would you agree to come back and talk to us about that?
Absolutely, I would love to.
All right, it's a date. We'll have you back to add that to our mix as well. So in closing, I'd like to thank you again for joining us and for the work you're doing every day in your business. Thank you for the work you've already done to flatten the curve and for your continue to focus on protecting our community. Continue to shop local, support neighbors, families, friends with your intentional purchasing choices, especially as we move towards reopening. And we are getting close. I mean, I'm not sure if we're going to get there any faster than than the plan is, but we are getting close. And, you know, make sure that when that does happen, you're paying a special attention to our personal service businesses that have been really hit hard, gyms, you know, any of these businesses that haven't been able to operate at all in some cases. We're here to help and get you through this. So feel free to email or call if you have any questions. Sign up for our rapid screening initiative. You know, this pandemic is not over, and we're going to be doing this, you know, far into the fall. Whether you've got 1 dose, 2 doses already in you, you're still prone to it, and we still have variants of concern that are making, you know, our recovery still challenging. So sign up; it's free. I mean, we're talking a massive investment by the country into this that they've now turned around and given to us for free to distribute. So please give us a shout and get involved. We have a few things coming up in the near future. On June 29th at 1 p.m., we'll have Krista Labriere back for a session on Facebook and Instagram Demystified, how to maximize and optimize your business presence. Her first webinar was really good. We have Chamber Networking at noon on June 30th. I may not be here for that one. I have something in that afternoon, but we will still have a great moderator and a good conversation on the 30th. Content creation and successful strategies for blogging on July 8th at 10 a.m. and eliminating pain for the workplace on July 20th at 1 p.m. So fairly busy calendar as we get through the summer, but we are taking a little bit of a foot off the gas as we get prepared for our golf tournament, which is on September 14th. I'm leading that out. You'll see a save the date on that one coming soon, and a few other programs that we're working on through the OCC. So with that, I'll say goodbye, and thank you again for joining us and for getting involved in the conversation. It was really good. All right. Cheers.
Take care.